She's being directly asked, will there be cuts to government services? And she can't even say no. She can't even say no to what basically everybody in this country wants, which is better public services. Unless she's going to go all Darren Jones and say, oh, well, it's all going to come from efficiency savings, and then we just have literally no choice at the next election.
Let's start, Rachel Reeves, with what you call the National Wealth Fund. Now, the idea of that is that the government would stump up about £7 billion to then encourage private sector to start putting money in. You've got the former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, coming on board, and the chief executive of Barclays. All your cozying up to the city seems to have had an effect.
Well, the National Wealth Fund is a key component of our growth plan, and Britain has never had a National Wealth Fund before. And the idea is to leverage in private sector investment alongside a government endowment to invest in some of the jobs and industries of the future, from carbon capture and storage to green hydrogen and green steel, floating offshore wind, and so much more. Areas where we can be a world leader, where we can bring good jobs, paying a decent wage.
So the National Wealth Fund is now the Green Investment Plan. So when she's talking about the National Wealth Fund putting money into green energy, I thought this is what GB Energy was for. Or is it all just one massive policy of we are going to have public investment to try and get in some private investment? They've got a 3-to-1 ratio, I believe, that the numbers they expect, whilst also get rid of some planning laws so they can get infrastructure built elsewhere. Am I seeing this right? That actually that GB Energy is just going to come out of the National Wealth Fund anyway? And basically GB Energy has always been a lie. That there's no state-owned energy company at all. There was strategic investments, and having a National Wealth Fund is not necessarily a bad plan. I like having a National Wealth Fund. Every state should have a National Wealth Fund. But all of that $7 billion that they've got going there, that is to be divided between all of these different public-private partnership projects.
Wage to Britain, start to bring people's energy bills down, and also boost our economic security by boosting our domestic energy security. And I'm really pleased that what businesses can see is that Labour have a serious plan. We are determined to get in that private sector investment, and they want to work with me and the Labour Party on how we can get that up and running if we are fortunate enough to win the next election.
But you said there, though, this is about getting green energy, green jobs, these things. But some of our viewers might think, well, if that's really what you were trying to do, why did you ditch your big promise to spend £28 billion a year on that?
When I first announced the Green Prosperity Plan, interest rates were 0.1%. We hadn't had the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng mini-budget, and I had to be honest with people that the damage that the Conservatives have done to the economy will affect what an incoming Labour government can do. But I've been working with businesses to look at how we can leverage in private sector investment to do the things that we want to do and need to do to get our economy growing, because unless we can grow our economy and boost productivity and investment, we haven't really got a chance to turn around the living standards that Sharon White was.
The thing is that this makes no sense. They still had the plan for £28 billion of green energy spending after the Liz Truss budget for like a whole year. It was a year after the Liz Truss budget that they then ditched the policy. Obviously, gilt yields went up, interest rates went up, but now they went back down again. So they're lower than they were after the fiscal event. So why? Is that a justification for scrapping those policies? Which we all know is a lie. We've covered it enough. We've seen all of the documents in The Guardian. We know exactly why they scrapped it. It was for optical reasons rather than policy reasons. But even the policy reasons don't make sense. Because she's saying, oh, well, because it's Kwasi Kwarteng that we have to do this. When they had this for like a year after that budget. And the economic situation is better now than it was post Truss Kwarteng budget. But apparently we can't have that investment now.
Was just talking about, and I am determined to be the chancellor that lifts living standards whilst also investing again in our public services.
Let's talk then about what you said then. You had to be honest with people, and I know that's what our viewers want from the people who come to the studio. I'm sure that you were pleased that the Tories took your plan to close loopholes for so-called non-DOMs, wealthy foreigners who don't pay as much tax here as they might. But that decision by Jeremy Hunt leaves you £2 billion short of your plans to pay for breakfast clubs at schools and extra appointments in the NHS. So where's that £2 billion going to come from?
Well, first of all, it is utterly humiliating that in the Chancellor's final budget, if you say that 15 budgets now, since the Conservatives came to office in 2010, it's taken them this long to abolish a gaping loophole in our tax system.
Where are you going to get that money from? That's what our viewers want to know.
Yes, so the government made these announcements on Wednesday, and I'm now going through all of the government documents to identify the funding stream to honour those commitments. And those commitments are to reduce NHS hospital waiting lists by 2 million a year, 700
Thing is, imagine, right? Imagine if at the start of all of this, they hadn't done all of this household budget nonsense. Remember that video I did responding to Labour Social when Phil did his video about why they use household budget analogies in their framing of fiscal policy from the government? If they'd have not bothered with that, and they had just run their policies without talking about all manifestos have to be costed. Because remember, Ken Clarke in 2017 said the Tory manifesto shouldn't be costed. And if they just not bothered with this household budget nonsense, when they all responded with this, you ought to go like, oh, I'm glad they've done this taxation. It's really good that wealth inequality is going to be decreased in this country thanks to this Conservative budget. But because they've been like, oh, well, our sums have to add up. We need to have this much money in, this much money coming out. All these questions are now being easily opened up by the journalists who then say, well, we're all now 2 billion short of these plans that you say that you have to fund using tax increases, which leaves them in a sticky situation where they have to answer, well, we're going to have to either do spending cuts or we're going to have to find another tax to raise.
1,000 additional dental appointments, as well as the free breakfast clubs in primary schools that Bridget Phillipson spoke about last week. But we'll do that in an orderly way.
But Keir Starmer says all the time, have the election in May, bring it on. That's in a matter of weeks. He says Labour's ready. Yep. Now, this plan was well trailed. You had a few weeks to think about it. No, you're not ready on it, are you?
Look, the government made their announcements on Wednesday. It is now Sunday. And I think your viewers would want to know that I was doing the work properly, that I wasn't just plucking numbers out of the air, but that I was methodically going through all the government documents to identify the funding streams so that all my sums add up. And I think that if there's one thing that you and your viewers know about me, is that everything in our manifesto will be fully costed and fully funded, including this pledge. And I will do the work properly, as I always do, to make sure that our sums add up.
Will you accept another of Jeremy Hunt's measures, cutting capital gains tax on second home sales? Now, the government said they're going to do that to try to encourage people to sell up, to provide more homes for other people. Would you reverse that if you end up in power?
Well, if you look at the way that the Office of Budget Responsibility have costed that, they say that it brings in revenue, and I'm not going to undo a measure that would end.
And even then, I don't even necessarily trust that the OBR are right on this bringing in revenue. But the fact that anybody, let alone a Labour shadow chancellor, is justifying a tax cut for landlords and property developers is absolute nonsense. Remember, the main function of taxation is to disincentivise poor behaviour and to decrease inequality and to give money itself value under a fiat system. You are increasing inequality by letting landlords and property investors save money, and it doesn't really matter whether or not you're using that to therefore fund things. And even then, how much extra really and truly is your Laffer curve economics going to be able to get your extra revenue for the exchequer by giving a bung essentially to landlords? Because that's what this is. When really we should be looking at massively increasing capital gains tax up to, 40% as the higher rate for all capital gains on anything other than main residence properties, which is currently already exempt from these kind of taxation anyway. Like the fact that we have a Labour shadow chancellor here backing a government giving a bung to landlords is complete nonsense.
End up costing taxpayers.
So you will accept that. Okay, that's good to have that on the record. When it comes to capital gains, your colleague Angela Rayner has been facing questions about whether she should have paid capital gains when she sold her home back in 2015. The Chancellor even made a jibe about it in the budget. Now, she said she did nothing wrong, but I just wonder, have you talked to her about it? Have you asked her about it?
Well, Angela's a friend and a colleague, and she is...
imagine using your time on the Headline Politics programme, on the state-subsidised broadcaster, when you're having this conversation about capital gains tax, well, the first question that you've asked is, where are you going to find the money to pay for these social programmes that you want to implement when you're in power, that you say that you want to be able to fund using tax increases? And then you get an answer from them. And the second question is about, well, this person's cutting capital gains tax. Do you think that's the correct thing to do? And then your third question isn't, well, why don't you raise capital gains tax? Why aren't you raising capital gains tax would be the obvious answer to the two questions that we've just already heard. And it won't even get asked. Instead, we're asking, what, have you not heard that there's some scurrilous rumour going around the newspapers about the deputy leader of the Labour Party and her tax affairs? Jesus Christ.
Made her representations on this, and that's good enough for me. And I think that people are ready to move on from that. But it's a bit rich for Jeremy Hunt, who owns multiple properties which he rents out, to make a jibe at Angela Rayner, who bought a council house and later sold it. I think that it's very, very different.
But one of her old neighbours has told the Times newspaper that she's not being straight about it. They said she's telling porkies. Have you asked her about it?
Well, look,
On a Murdoch hack newspaper, as I've been asking questions about it, that's really much more important than whether or not the Shadow Chancellor can afford to fund the NHS or feed children. I'm sure that that's far more important in terms of the national discourse, what some person who once lived near Angela Rayner thinks about her tax affairs. Jesus Christ.
Seen the representations and what Angela has said, I have absolute faith in Angela. She's been very clear. She's taken advice and has explained the situation, and that's good enough for me.
And also, literally, Rachel Reeves is talking about the idea of reducing capital gains tax for landlords and property investors. And then the very next question is, well, Jeremy Hunt's got all these properties, and she's not linking them together. Like, because she's accepted the framing of what the OBR have said about the potential returns on cutting capital gains tax for landlords. And then the very next answer to a question is, well, actually, Jeremy Hunt's a landlord. Do you not think that's more important? And yet she's not even drawing the link between that to hammer Jeremy Hunt for his tax cut for himself. This is all terrible. This is all useless. Okay, but we'll continue watching.
While we're talking about Angela Rayner, her big plan, a big part of Labour's plan, is to really extend workers' rights. In fact, from day one, essentially give more or less the same rights to everybody, whether they're freelancers or whether they're somebody who's working part-time. Can you guarantee that that full package will be in the Labour manifesto?
Yes, we have committed to an extension of workers' rights, including banning zero-hour contracts, getting rid of fire and rehire, and having a real minimum wage. Obviously, the Low Pay Commission will set that. But this is a big extension of the rights of working people, because if an economy is not working for working people, it's not working at all. And at the moment, too many people are stuck in insecure, precarious work. We went into the pandemic with 11 million people having less than £100 worth of savings. That reflects not just low pay, but also terribly insecure work for too many people. We do want to change that, but of course we'll work with businesses to make sure that our plans work for them as well, including, for example, probation periods in employment contracts. So, we do want to make changes, but all of our...
What about fair pay agreements? Obviously, things like getting rid of zero-hour contracts, even though the Labour Party have used them in the last 3 years, even like fire and rehire and zero-hour contracts, get rid of those, that's good. Like, the really important thing, the really important policy of fair pay agreements. Now, it may be that she's not looking at saying so because she thinks that it makes them look too left-wing. But the current policy documents that have been released, the most recent set of policy documents from the Labour Party, say that fair pay agreements are still going to be part of their policy platform. But it's interesting, when most people need more money, she has just said that people don't have much money, and she's not mentioning the key policy that would give people more money, which is a fair pay agreement. She's not even talking about. It doesn't make any sense optically, doesn't make any sense rhetorically for them not to mention it, unless it's something that they're planning on ditching come the election.
Plans are pro-business and pro-worker, because the two things are the two sides of the same coin.
But you've given a clear...
No, they're not. They are diametrically opposed in interest. A business wants to pay its workers as little as possible to maximise profits, and workers want to be paid as much as possible to maximise their living standards. That is a directly conflicting relationship. You can't be both pro-business and be pro-worker. You can mandate that conflict if you want. You can mandate and say, well, look, we understand these are competing interests, but we're going to try and make a compromise that works for everybody in the interest of working people as a Labour Party. But this lie about being both pro-worker and pro-business, just nonsensical, just completely nonsensical.
Commitment on the record that you will have the full package in your manifesto, and that's interesting to hear. Let's look then at the bigger picture. Now, as you've already said, people know about you, you care about every single penny. You've said already, if you do make it into power, you'll inherit the worst set of public finances since World War II. You've also said many times you're not going to borrow money for everyday spending. You've also said you're not going to put lots of taxes up. Now, let's be clear with everybody watching. That means that after the election, whoever wins, as Sharon said, there's basically going to be no extra cash for public services, or very little. And that means real terms cuts to some government departments. Can you confirm today, if Labour wins the election, there will be real terms cuts to some government spending?
Well, it is clear that the inheritance that a Labour government would have if we do win the next election will be the worst since the Second World War. And I have to be honest that we're not going to be able to turn things around straight away, but we will get to work on all of that. And I have announced, Laura, an initial injection of cash into our struggling public services. There's the commitments around reducing NHS waiting lists and breakfast clubs at primary schools.
Which at the moment you can't tell us how you spend for, but just...
We will fund those pledges. But also, Laura, beyond that, that. We have said that we would extend the windfall tax on the big profits the energy giants are making, and we would invest that money in moving to the low-carbon industries of the future. VAT and business rates on private schools and putting that money into the 93% of children at state schools.
But we're asking
properly taxing the...
So why don't you just say that you're going to use the 8 billion from your windfall tax to fund your NHS workforce plan and your breakfast money for kids, and then just say our investment plan is going to come from fiscal expansion? Again, because they physically can't get themselves out of this bind they've put themselves in because of their household budget rhetoric. They literally cannot. They cannot say we're going to use fiscal expansion for anything. They can't say it. And so they get into this conflict where they can't answer any questions, and she looks rubbish. And again, on top of that, she's being directly asked, will there be cuts to government services? And she can't even say no. She can't even say no to what basically everybody in this country wants, which is better public services. Unless she's going to go all Darren Jones and say, oh, it's all going to come from efficiency savings, and then we just have literally no choice at the next election.
Private equity bosses to put more money into our public services.
But we're asking a really clear question here. Can you confirm today that in the first couple of years of a Labour government, some departments would face real terms cuts? Because people want to know, and our viewers sometimes feel like you're not giving enough information. This is what one of them wrote in to say, John Sinclair. He's asking, when will you come clean about how you'll deal with the abominable state of our national finances to support public services? So can you confirm today, if you want to be honest with people, that some government departments would face a real terms cut?
Well, at the moment, the government have not set out their plans by individual departments, so we haven't got a spending review. I will do a spending review quickly when if we win the election, but that's not something that's possible to do from opposition. But I do know that public services need more money. That's why we will make that initial injection. But remember also, the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecasts are based on the government's plans, and the government's plans do not include our comprehensive plan to grow the economy. Our National Wealth Fund is about bringing in private sector investment. That will mean more taxes paid. That will mean more money for public services.
And you've explained that, but that would take time. And this is the important thing here. At the moment, and you explain this very clearly, that you want to stick to the same kind of spending rules that the Conservatives do as well.
There you go. And this is, again, another thing that something that they've imposed on themselves. The fiscal rules are self-imposed. The household budget nonsense is self-imposed. The sticking to the same fiscal rules as the Conservative plan, sticking to their spending plans. This is all self-imposed nonsense. This is all self-imposed, and they no reasons to do any of it. And basically all they've done is just allow the Tories to salt the earth so badly that they can't even simply answer a question about public service funding by saying, no, there won't be real terms cuts, or we've got to look at the books, or we've got to do this, or we've got to do that. Just saying, no, there won't be public service cuts. There won't be public service cuts. We've got this windfall tax. We could tax some capital, like they should be doing, capital gains, taxing wealth, all the things that people genuinely want when it comes to taxation. They could say that, say, well, that's all going to go into public services. The public services that you understand are completely wrecked. We'll get this injection directly from these increased taxation on people who have the money to go private. These people who have more money than they know what to do with. These people who are very, very asset rich, who don't usually get taxed very much because we tax incomes rather than assets. They could do all of these things, and they don't do it. They don't do any of it. They are obsessed with the idea that because Blair won in 1997 by sticking to Conservative spending plans, people were worried about Labour's plans for the economy. They're like, if you're worried about the economy, we'll just do what the Tories will do, and then whatever happens after that, you know you can trust us. And sure, maybe that was useful in 1997 to get New Labour into power, whatever it might have been. I didn't agree with it. I didn't agree with New Labour, whatever. That might have been something that was necessary then. It's not like every single Labour victory ever in history has come from them promising to be like the Tories. Wilson never did that. Attlee never did that. And this is at a time when public services are in a dire situation. The economy is in the toilet. There's no justification for this level of capitulation to neoliberal economics, given the situation that the country's in, given the political appetite for state-led policy in this country. People wanted state-led policy when they voted for Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson is promising more fiscal expansion than Rachel Reeves is promising. Never really happened, let's be real, but there was at least something people wanted to vote for then. And they just obsessed, well, they won't vote for us if we're not like the Tories, when they're already ahead in terms of managing the economy. Blair wasn't ahead of Major on managing the economy.
You don't want to put up lots of tax, and you don't want to borrow for the day-to-day. And that leaves some people wondering, what the difference is between your plans for the economy and the Conservatives' plan for the economy. I'd just like to play you a question from one of our viewers, Ian, a voter who we met a few months ago when we spoke to lots of viewers in Manchester. You can listen to this.
I'm normally a Labour voter, and I'd like to know what the difference is between the Conservative and Labour's fiscal policy, as I'm not seeing a very clear dividing line, especially since the...
Now, Ian's a Labour voter. He's asking you, what's the difference?
There's two.
Well, have you considered, Laura, that because he's a Labour voter already, he literally doesn't matter? His opinion is completely irrelevant to the current leadership of the Labour Party. He's not somebody whose vote they need to win come the election, because that's the lens that they view essentially every part of policy making, is how can we shape our policies so that we can get Conservative Labour switchers. And the irony is that a lot of these Conservative Labour switchers probably would vote for Labour on the understanding that they funded the NHS. Funding for the NHS is the most important issue. Cost of living crisis, funding the NHS. Everybody cares about this stuff. Old people especially. Like the traditional Labour voting, the traditional Conservative voting group is the older generations at the moment anyway, the last kind of 30 years of voting patterns. And they're the ones who are going to be losing their lives early if they can't get through the NHS waiting lists. This is like the top priority for voters. There's no reason at all why they would lose like huge numbers of votes. If they said, we're going to be taxing wealth, every penny is going to go into the NHS spending to bring waiting lists down. Yet instead, because they want to look as Tory as possible, they're going, well, actually, no, we're not going to raise taxes for that. No. We can't even commit to there not being real-term spending cuts in government departments when asked directly by Laura Kuenssberg. No, we're not going to do any of that. What we are going to do, though, is invite in the private sector. The door is wide open, in the words of Wes Streeting, for bringing in the private sector into the NHS.
Two clear differences. The first is the initial injection of cash into our public services by closing those tax loopholes and having a proper windfall tax on the energy companies.
Crumbs
wait
in
a
the big
second.
picture.
They're not crumbs. £1.5 billion pounds for the...
Yes, they are. So that is like just over 10 billion in total. That's absolutely tiny in comparison to the government's overall budget. And that's got to go around every single department. Councils underfunded, schools underfunded, NHS underfunded, and not just capital investment, which of course the NHS does need more of and schools do need more of, but day-to-day spending too. All of these things are entirely underfunded in terms of day-to-day spending. What, 10 billion to go around all of these, plus play for your breakfast clubs pledge, plus play for your NHS workforce plan? Not only is this nonsense because it's not entirely prudent in terms of what needs funding and how much money there is to go around, it also doesn't add up in the weird household budget nonsense way that you want your sums to add up. This is so silly. They could fundamentally change the way this country thinks about taxation, talk about contribution rather than burden. You're 100% right, Ben. They should be using this pulpit that they've got. They've got a giant pulpit to speak from. The whole world is under the entire implicit assumption here that they will form the next government. They're being listened to by other governments from around the world. Keir Starmer is going on trips to see people from the United States government, from Germany, from France, touring the EU on as the presumptive prime minister. He's been coronated already by not getting proper media scrutiny throughout this entire period. And he could just use this as the fundamental time to reset the entirety of public discussion around our country's economy. In the wake of conservative economics failing us in every single way. We've not had private sector growth. We've not had public sector growth. We've not had fair policies. We've not had a reduction in inequality. Everything has got worse under conservative economics. People don't like what they're doing. And instead of saying, they did it wrong, we'll do something different, they're saying, they did it wrong, we'll do their wrong things, but we'll manage it better, and that's all we need to do to make this country better. It's ridiculous. And all we're doing is just setting the public up for a continuation of these narratives, as I spoke about in my video responding to Phil before.
VAT and business rates on private schools, £7.7 billion over the course of the Parliament by closing the loopholes, etc. So those are not crumbs. That is real money to go into our public services that the Conservatives aren't investing today. But second, in the end, you've got to grow the economy. This is the point that Andy Haldane was making on your programme last week. We need to get people back into work, ensure that they've got the skills to succeed and boost productivity. And our plans are about doing exactly that. The creation of the National Wealth Fund.
Talking about Andy Haldane last week, do you know what he said about your fiscal rule, that debt to GDP has to be falling at the end of the Parliament? He said that was stupid and had to go. He said that your fiscal rule was bad. It's interesting how you're very happy to carry his lines when he's talking about, well, actually, all we need to do is boost productivity, we need to get people into work, whatever it might be. But as soon as he criticises a policy that you do have, Suddenly you're, not listening to his recommendations about my fiscal rules. They're ironclad, they're watertight, they're non-negotiable. As Ben pointed out in chat as well, John McDonnell made a really good case for saying, well, actually, we should change it to 10 years rather than 5 years, because the decade of national renewal rhetoric is actually something I agree with. This is good rhetoric. We need to have a new Attlee. After our economy was destroyed by the Second World War, Attlee was like, no, sod fiscal rules. We're going to invest, we're going to nationalise, we're going to create a new normal for the people who served our country during the war, and it won them the election by a very large margin. And we need to do the same now. Economy's been wrecked by not just conservative incompetence, but effects outside our control, like wars going on in Europe and the problems to do with what happened during the pandemic. We have essentially a war economy throughout this entire period. It's justifiable to have this decade of national renewal, using fiscal expansion to do so, investing hugely in the future of this country, and they're not doing anything of the sort at the time when the country desperately needs it. They're the worst opportunity for the worst possible time.
That we've spoken about this morning. Businesses say, that's why Aviva and Barclays have signed up to this task force. They say that there is the money ready to go if government put in place the right structures to unlock it. Reform of the planning system to get Britain building again. New homes and energy infrastructure as well. Reforming the apprenticeship levy so we can get people the skills they need. Now, some of these things take time and the full impact takes time. But if we can get building homes, 1.5 million in the first term of a Labour government, that is money going into the economy.
Again, you have no way of promising this. You have literally no way of promising this. Your entire housing plan, literally all of the housing plan, is just, let's deregulate the sector and fingers crossed, let's hope they build. No state investment, no nothing. Just deregulate the private sector, hope they do it. That's it. That's their entire promise for building these 1.5 million homes. That's it. What happens if they don't build, Rachel? What happens if they just build luxury flats that people can't afford? What then? What if they build things that get bought by private investors, not for the sake of actually for people to live in? What if they're bought by people who want to invest in Airbnb? What if they're bought by people who are just Russian oligarchs using it as an investment vehicle? You have no plans to stop this. Andrew Fisher on Politics Live a year ago was about banning foreign investors, limiting holiday homes and limiting things like short-term lets. The Scottish government know that. They're doing that currently, limiting the amount of people who can do short-term lettings because they're essentially a cancer upon our urban environment. Residential homes that should be for people to live in as their primary residence being explicitly used for Airbnb. Those people are getting shafted by the SNP and the Green Coalition or Holyrood. Do Labour have any plan to deal with the scourge of Airbnb? No, they're not doing it. They can't make this promise.
Right away, and if the economy grows, you bring in tax revenues.
But you admit there yourself a lot of the things you want to do, and the full impact takes a while.
But you have an
impact
straight away.
But what many people want to understand, though, is given that you agree with the Conservatives on cutting national insurance, you're accepting that, you've ruled out raising income tax, you have the same rule to get debt down, which does constrict things.
Talk about capital gains tax, talk about wealth taxes. Why are we focused on income tax when nobody is going to raise income tax? Because it'd be terrible to do so. I mean, apart from using fiscal drag. She's not even said she wants to bring back fiscal drag as well. They've not even necessarily committed to stopping fiscal drag too. And her point was, well, you're not going to be raising income tax. They're also not going to be raising capital gains and wealth taxes, the two taxes people do want us to raise, Laura. Why are you not asking about this?
Admitted that today. What is the big difference between the two parties' economic offer? Because lots of well-respected economists actually say when you look at it, essentially they're not that different. And the IFS, very well-respected think tank, for example, this week said, look, there's actually a conspiracy of silence between the two parties, not being fully honest with the public about how tough things might be.
Well, I've said I'm under no illusions about the scale of the inheritance, and I do need to be honest that it's going to take a while to turn around the challenges that we see. And I think viewers recognise that Sharon said it's going to be the toughest job in politics. But I relish the chance because there's always choices to be made.
Well, and that's exactly the point. And
yeah, I'm just going to essentially follow up what Laura was saying there. Yeah, there are choices to be made. There are tough choices. Again, they keep saying, well, we need to make tough choices by not actually investing in what's happening for poor people, keeping a 2-child benefit cap. These are easy choices. It's very easy to shit on the poor. It's very difficult. You know, it's actually a tough choice to decide, no, No, enough of the rich just getting away with everything, having the proverbial disco, as that sound that Kath played earlier, the legendary quote from Eddie Dempsey is rightly saying, like, the rich people in our country literally having a disco with all the money in the world. As Mick Lynch says, there are more billionaires than we've ever had in this country. A tough choice would be to go to these people and say, no, enough is enough. Time to pay your fair bloody share. Time to pay for the services that we need to keep this country flourishing. Time for you to cough up the money that you've taken from the poor people of this country and put it back into the public services that are necessary for the functioning of our country. That's a tough choice. What have they done? They've not said to these people they have to pay taxes. No, what they've done is they've allowed them to donate to the party and allowed them to advise them on policy as well. Who? We don't know, because according to Emily Thornberry in Open Democracy, they're going to be keeping all of their lobbyists hidden. We don't even know who is going to be setting the policy going forward. That's your Labour Party. Ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary pals at home, that is your Labour Party of the future. Labour Party.
Andy Haldane, who you referenced, actually said last week, he said he thought you should be much more flexible about the spending rules. You could make that choice, and yet you've made a choice to stick to the same spending rules as the Conservatives.
Look, I worked at the Bank of England like Andy Haldane for many years before I became an MP, and I feel that the importance of fiscal rules in providing a constraint in which governments act is incredibly important. You saw what happened when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng tried to circumvent the fiscal rules. They didn't allow the Office for Budget Responsibility.
Borrowing for tax cuts, unfunded tax cuts with no growth plan, is not the same as borrowing to fund supply-side investment in new industry, where you can show where that growth is going to lead to higher tax returns in future. These are two different things. The fact that the leader of the opposition is trying to compare these two things just shows you how pathetic the Labour Party are. The current leadership of the Labour Party are absolutely pathetic. They're taking a golden opportunity to steal the economic forethought of this country and push it into post-Keynesian economics. And instead they're using it to say, well, actually, Liz Truss crashed the economy with tax cuts, so that means we can't make investments. By comparing these two, they are proverbially shitting the bed, quite frankly. This is the most infuriating thing of all of this, is the golden opportunity to rewrite the script. And they're using it to push even more neoliberal austerity politics. What do we even do? What do we do about this? I mean, I'll tell you what, you have to vote for the Green Party, because they're the ones promising for taxing wealth, for universal basic income, for the green investment that the Labour Party have ditched, council houses, all these things that we should be doing to solve these problems. The Green Party have already promised those in their manifesto, or in their policy plan. All these things that Labour won't do, the Green Party will do it.
To report they undermined the Bank of England. I won't do that because making sure that the sums add up, making sure that we start to get debt on a downward trajectory is important. But my fiscal rules are different from those of the government. We separate current and day-to-day expenditure from capital investment. That is important because business investment in the UK is lower than in any other G7 economy. We need that public investment to leverage in the private sector investment. But if we can grow our economy, we change the trade-offs that government have to make.
And it is about choices, isn't it?
Yeah, but that is why growth is the number one mission of an incoming Labour government.
And if
because
you win,
that is the way we sustainably improve living standards and get the money that I know we desperately need. I know we desperately need for our public services.
And if you win, as you hope, and if you then get the economy growing, which is your ambition, what then would be Chancellor Rachel Reeves?
And also what's silly about this is that the one thing, she says that we need productivity, right? The one thing that's failing in this country is productivity. Well, the two ways you get productivity, the two main ways to get productivity, first of all, is to ensure that everybody's healthy, get people stop being off sick, which of course will mean reducing NHS waiting times, because that is explicitly why people are too sick. Because they can't have an NHS appointment because of lack of investment, because of Conservative austerity. Is she promising to put loads of money into the NHS? No, she's not doing that. So she's not going to get the growth that she needs from that extra productivity, which is, of course, the magic ingredient to higher growth. I agree with most standard economists on productivity being a good way of getting higher growth. But they're not going to do that. What's the second way of getting much better productivity? Having a more educated workforce, a more skilled workforce. Are they promising to invest huge amounts of extra money into education outside of the very small amount of the taxation on the fees of private schools to go into state schools? No. On top of that, no. Nothing at all. No discussion about fixing the concrete scandal, like we saw in the Labour policy document, doesn't even get a mention in the Labour policy document.
Instinct. If you have £7 billion that emerges from the economy, it could be a penny off income tax, or it could be £7 billion for colleges or courts. What's your instinct?
Well, look, I want taxes on working people to be lower, but you've always got to explain where the money comes from for that. But look, the thing that got me into politics in the first place was education and schools. I went to school in the 80s and 90s, the last time that we had a long period of Conservative government. And when I was in the sixth form, our sixth form was 2 prefab huts in a playground. Our school library was turned into a classroom because there were more students than there was space.
So services is your instinct rather than more tax
education. You know, when Tony Blair said education, 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 that's what got me involved in politics, because I felt for the first time you had a political leader that was talking about the things that mattered to me and my family and my life. And the last Labour government turned around our schools and our hospitals. But for me, giving all children...
Do you want to tell us how they invested money in schools and in hospitals without increasing the national debt? Do you want to tell us how that happened, Rachel? Because, of course, again, as JDM points out in chat, there's no necessary reason why you have to get the debt down. It doesn't have to be falling. There are plenty of countries that have strong economies with a high debt to GDP ratio. But nevertheless, even if you take that as a given, do you want to tell them about the PFIs, Rachel, or shall I? Shall I tell them about the PFIs? Because that's how the schools and NHS hospitals were funded during the Blair era, was private finance initiatives, which left them with loads of toxic debt, real debt, not like fake debt, like quantitative easing or money generated from the Bank of England. Because you know that, because you work there. I know that you know that. This is all basically lies. I know you're telling lies to people here, Rachel. But it's PFIs that funded that stuff to keep the debt down. When we could have actually just used capital investment. But no, we had to completely toxicify both of these departments with private sector investment that you say you now want more of come the next government. Looking forward to that. Jesus.
Well, are you convinced or critical? You can email me, koonsberg@bbc.co.uk,
Critical,
or on social
not
media.
convinced.
You can use the hashtag BBC
Very
UK.
critical.
That's on X or on Instagram or wherever else all these things are these days. And the headlines are unfolding on the BBC Live page, as you can always follow along. Sharon, firstly to you then, what was your reaction to Rachel Reeves? Because she gave a hint that she would rather put money into services than cut tax, but she's very reluctant still to show a bit more ankle about some of her plans.
I mean, interesting the focus on growth and productivity, which I think whoever wins the next election, I think is absolutely crucial. I think we're going to have to get really creative with the partnerships with business and business investment, just because there's so little room for any government, really, of whatever political complexion to spend more money. So
there's plenty of room if you're investing in the supply side. Look at America. America running a 7% deficit because it's all going into supply side investment. Read the deficit myth, please. Because even the experts they get on just go, oh, there's no money left. Liam Byrne letter, what are you going to do?
Great to hear her talking about leveraging business investment. I also think there's a role for business on public services. So with a partnership, we're trying to be the employer of choice for young people from the care system. Interestingly, was actually...
Oh, yeah, of course. You're bringing a boss of a company and they're like, actually, I think there's plenty of room in the private sector for public service provision. Oh, I bet you think there's loads of room in the public sector for private service provision. They all want a little piece of the government pie, don't they?
Feature of Jeremy Hunt's budget, doing more for younger people from disadvantaged groups. So I think the boundaries between the state and business will have to get much more connected, not just in terms of those sort of growth and infrastructure and investment, but actually how we think about public service reform.
So basically business is going to have to pick up some of this
We're
slack.
going to have to step in.
But is that, just briefly, is that really realistic? Because I have to say, I've heard lots of politicians over the years say lots of things like that. We'd like to have partnerships, we want to work more with business. Is it realistic that that could be a game changer?
I think it is inevitable. So, I mean, Rachel has talked today about new employment rights from day one for a new government. That's got profound implications for business. We're very positive, obviously, as a partnership about doing more for our workers, for our partners. But inevitably, and you've got lots of businesses, we already provide GP and mental health services because the state isn't as present as it was. And I think there has to be an open and honest conversation about how much the state can do and where the private sector needs to step in.
Michael, what did you make of what you heard there?
Again, literally, they just invite people from businesses onto these programs and they'll just very specifically say, well, actually, unfortunately, the government can't do everything, so they're going to have to give loads of stuff over to the private sector. And everyone just nods along like, oh, I'm sure you're saying that entirely objectively. No subjective material interest of the business sector to want the state to throw money at them for public service provision whatsoever. All very innocent. Or we just want to help with public services. We definitely don't want to usurp the role of the state in providing something that is an an inelastic market so we can then cream off the top. No, heaven forfend, someone might suggest that private business might want to take state money for free. What a crazy insinuation, Helena.
Ben.
Well, I've got a lot of respect for Rachel Reeves because, unlike Keir Starmer, she refused to serve in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet at the time when Keir Starmer...
Crumbly crumbles, rent-free every time. Never, ever, ever leaves the frontal cortexes of every single politician in this country. The jumbly crumbly jam man. Oh, dear.
And if I'm going to live rent-free in his head...
was urging us to make Jeremy Corbyn our next Prime Minister. The problem she's got, and you touched on it in your interview, is that Labour are committed to Angela Rayner's trade union reform package. That would make it easier for trade unions to go on strike and more difficult for employers to run their businesses. And that puts the kibosh on any hope of economic growth.
Really? Because Sharon...
That's, first of all, just completely not true. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, all of the countries with good trade unions who have fair pay agreements and collective bargaining all have better economic growth than we do. So you can shut the hell up about that one, first of all. Second of all, remember during the Rachel Reeves interview when she said, oh, well, actually, we believe that workers' rights and business rights actually coexist together nicely. Pro-business and pro-worker is one and the same. And then we have a business owner and a representative of the business class from the Conservative Party, both here saying, well, actually, these things are diametrically opposed. If you make workers' rights better, businesses are going to be worse off. And I'm like, it also turns out you can't be pro-business and pro-worker. As soon as you go anything pro-worker,
rent-free in his head,
all the pro-business people go, oh, you're not pro-us anymore, are you? Yeah, because it's a diametrically opposed relationship. It's a conflictual relationship between those two things. Welcome to capitalism. Marx is never wrong.
Sarah said she's happy about it.
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what Sharon said.
You are
but
a liar.
The truth is that it's the private sector that creates wealth. We need the private sector to prosper. We need employers to be able to run their businesses. And if you've got more strikes, you're not going to get economic growth.
Sharon...
And well, first of all, I'm actually going to defend Labour here. Having more trade union rights, having fair pay agreements, having collective bargaining, potentially, doesn't actually mean more strikes. Usually, a fair pay agreement means less strikes, fewer strikes, if you have a collective bargaining agreement, a fair pay agreement, because you don't actually have to force the employer to the table because you can have sector-wide agreements. Now, they're not going to do sectoral bargaining. The fair pay agreements is more going to be about having more trade union representation within wage setting, and that's a good thing. But that means fewer strikes, actually. If you're not engaging in individual transactions on wage setting rather than having an agreement that everybody agrees to, and unless the employers are being really, really tight-fisted, you actually get fewer strikes with fair pay agreements. You don't strike very often in Sweden, Denmark, Norway at all. None of these countries have strikes very often because they all have the fair pay agreements and that's what they accept. So that's not even right on his end. Second of all, it's not the private sector that creates wealth. It's productivity that creates wealth. It's labour that creates wealth. It is the workers that create the wealth. That investment can come from the public sector, it can come from collective investment, or it can come from private individuals. It's a political choice where that investment comes from, and therefore who reaps the dividends, whether or not it's the state, therefore the people collectively as a whole, whether it's the workers who own a business themselves, choosing how that wealth is redistributed, or if it's privately owned, the private singular owner or the shareholders get to decide where all of that wealth goes. And that is your political choice there. But the wealth itself is always created by working people. It's created by the people who are being productive. Capital is not productive. Nature is not productive. But the labour that is applied with capital onto nature is what creates the productivity in the first place and creates the wealth for everybody else. It is not the private sector that creates wealth. That's nonsense. That's bullshit. Shut the hell up, Michael.
Very simple.
Briefly, on those reforms, is that something that concerns you as an employer?
I think if it's done in a common sense way in consultation with business, I think employees, as I say now...
Well, literally, even the business owner is saying, well, you have to consult us first. Again, what are they going to say? Or we have to pay our workers more. Well, that's against the material interest of the business. Turns out, you can't be pro-worker and pro-business after all. What a surprise.
We don't call ourselves employees and partners, but having stability and confidence in your employment and in the rights of your... the rights that are provided by your business, I think that is a That is a potential
But we know,
positive.
we know what they're committed to, and I bet it's something Rachel never mentions in her
Well, it was
breakfasts with
interesting.
big
Well, it was interesting. She gave a very clear commitment. It would be in the manifesto. But Hugh, now you are a Green campaigner. I think you're a member of the Green Party.
I am.
You listened to Jeremy Hunt this week. You listened to Rachel Reeves this morning. What did you think?
I am a member of the Green Party. I voted Labour when they promised things could only get better. But what I'm hearing today is things are only going to stay the same. What Labour's become very good at is ruling things out. They keep saying, well, we're going to... with some idea of somehow calming a stressed electorate, they keep ruling out things that would actually make me much more likely to vote for them. I mean, they've ruled out £28 billion on green energy. They've ruled out cancelling the new oil and gas licences, which are completely unnecessary and should be cancelled. They've ruled out proportional representation, even though their own membership voted for it at conference. They've ruled out working with the Progressive Coalition, working with the Green Party and the Lib Dems. And they've ruled out one thing that I think we should focus on for a minute, because we need to raise more tax revenue. We absolutely must. And it might surprise people to know that a lot of wealthy people are in favour of paying more tax. And a wealth tax, which has been costed by the Green Party, could raise 70 to 100 billion pounds that could really be spent on projects that would make a difference.
But I think a lot of your viewers might
100%, literally 100% of every single word. I would have also mentioned council housing, because we do need more council houses, but I know a bunch of Greens are all very NIMBY, I know, right? I'm working on it, okay? I'm working on it really hard. I'll get back to you on that one. But everything else you said there, wealth tax especially, all 100% correct. Literally 100% absolutely right. It's frustrating that the representative we have for the Green Party is just some, like, posho, rural celebrity chef, rather than somebody who actually will be the beneficiary of all of these policies. But I'm glad there's somebody saying it. But the really important, salient thing here is that if we want to have a proper NHS, proper schools, everything being back to where it was in 2010 in terms of funding for councils and things like that, we will have to raise more in taxes. And that's going to have to come from the wealthy. And £100 billion worth of wealth tax is a gigantic amount of money that we could use in investing in high quality public services, which are things that people want. People want more money spent on the NHS. They want more money spent on schools. They want more money in their local council. And the vast majority of people are not going to be the multi-millionaires, because it'd be £10 million, like the minimum amount for this wealth tax, is according to the Green Party's policy anyway, could be enough to hugely transform all of these public sector service provision. And Labour just won't do it. They won't do it. No, can't raise taxes on wealthy people, because they're the ones advising them on policy now. They're the ones investing in the Labour Party as a brand now. The Trevor Chins of this world. The capital investments and private investors of the Labour Together group that installed Keir Starmer in a soft coup in 2020. So much for a Labour Party.
Say to you, Hugh, look, the tax burden is at nearly record highs. People are feeling really, really hard up.
I'm not talking about increasing the tax burden on anyone who's having a hard time. I'm talking about what is the point of a Labour government if they can't bring together, narrow the difference between the extremely wealthy and those who are experiencing food and fuel poverty and finding life really difficult? Only a wealth tax will do that.
So, Sharon, with your Treasury economist,
I love that literally, how is she allowed to get away with this? Well, which is a Tory, that's why. But like the fact that he's literally said, well, they're going to do a wealth tax. Oh, the tax burden's high. And like, yeah, working people are not going to be paying a bloody wealth tax. How many working people are hard done by have assets worth £10 million? You fucking idiot. You could even if you don't want to spend this money on investing in public services, Labour have said one of the things they want to do is reduce the tax burden on working people, something I personally agree with. I absolutely agree with reducing the taxes on working people. £100 billion worth of taxation on the super rich using a wealth tax on £10 million worth of assets or more, right? That amount of money could be used to absolutely slash taxes on working people. You could do the entire cut on national insurance twice and still have 20 billion left over using that finance. Twice over you could get rid of national insurance, which would save everybody who works money. You could raise the threshold for income tax. You could spend that money on universal basic income or on increasing working tax credits. You could spend all of this money could be used to benefit poor people in response to the high taxation on them.
Our hat on, if you put that on for a moment, would something like a wealth tax be realistic? Because on the right, you get people saying, actually, that would drive business away, it would have a negative effect. But when you looked at it, I'm sure the Treasury's looked at it over the years, what effect would it have?
So, I mean, with my former hat on, I mean, if I were approaching a spending and tax review after the election. The things that worry you are the tax burden is high and getting higher. There's much less room to tax, but how do you do this in a way that's fair? So I think particularly as both a business person but also a Treasury economist, your worry is you don't want to drive the wealth creators that you need to support growth and support productivity.
Many of those wealth creators are on record as saying they're happy to pay more taxes. A very interesting organisation called the Patriotic.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's frustrating. Again, this is what happens when you get people like this on. Sure, his broad policy strokes were okay, and I agree with him. His rhetoric needs some work, though, because he's saying, oh, well, the wealth creators, they might not be able to invest. The wealth creators are the workers. Workers are wealth creators. The people who are productive are the ones who create the wealth. Again, the capital can come, investing-wise, collectively from the government or from the private sector. That just chooses how we distribute where that wealth goes to once it's being created. But where the wealth comes from initially is from the labour. It's from productive working people. It's not from billionaires. It's not from capitalists. It's not even necessarily from the government either. But the government, if they do make the investment into the people who create the wealth, which is the workers, can then be used to redistribute that money equitably towards a member of the population, towards the people, for the many rather than the few. Yet when you leave it all up to the private sector, it's shareholders that benefit. It's capital investors that benefit. It's the rich who already have all those assets to benefit. But he is right. Rich people are already happy to pay more taxes. That is true. Some rich people. But the idea that taxing wealth creators is going to make people not invest if they can see returns is just nonsense. It's nonsense. Complete nonsense.
Millionaires. Have a look at their website. There's all sorts of things that could be done to take some of this extreme wealth and narrow the gap between the very rich and the poor in the UK.
Michael.
And as Gary Stevenson says, right, this isn't just a wish list. This is necessary to stop our economy from fucking collapsing, right? The message is your house is on fire. And if you do not fix it, things will only get worse, and it'll get worse for your kids as well. You are bequeathing a broken economy to your children unless you fix wealth inequality. And the only way you're going to fix wealth inequality is by taxing the rich. Our government gave £800 billion away to the rich over the course of the pandemic.
So is that something you think is realistic?
No, I think we've heard over the years these suggestions that you only tax the very rich. All these taxes, such as the one that Hugh's recommending, would go far down the ladder. They would hurt not just the very rich, they would hurt ordinary working people who may have been...
That's a lie! That's a complete... How many ordinary working people do you know, Michael, who have £10 million of assets? How many people do you know who's a regular working person with £10 million of assets? You know zero, because they don't fucking exist. I hope you know I torture myself for you guys. I hope you know that. I hope you know that doing this job makes me lose my fucking mind. Because I just have to constantly hear these lies get spouted every single day.
Able to save something, they would hit people who save to own their own homes. They would have a disastrous effect on our economy, because too many people, for very many people, wealth is transferable and they would just leave the country. And the wealth creators, as Sharon has said, are the people that we need to make our economy grow.
Well, I know we talk about...
That's what happens when all the people you have only talk about redistribution rather than the sources of wealth here. Because, of course, Hugh is fine and I like his points of view, but he's so not directly educated on these topics that he can't refute this by talking about where wealth actually does come from, which is from working people. Like, if you had a trade unionist on, right, if Mick Lynch was in this position where Hugh is in, he would know exactly where to say that the people who generate the wealth of our civilization are the people who do the work and are the productive ones. Wealth creators are working people, but he can't respond to this because he's on like a level kind of zero argument about redistribution, where, of course, we should be taxing the rich. The rich have got all the money now. We need to take that back to fix our society, okay? But once you've made that change, you've taxed that and taken the money away, you need to change the shape of the economy to ensure that the capital flows don't go back to the rich again. That's going to involve more social ownership. I don't mind whether that's state ownership or whether it's cooperative ownership. I don't mind what way around you do it, but you're going to have to change the ownership model at least some way so that we don't have this divergence in wealth again. And you also have to understand how that wealth is created, where that productivity comes from. And that's where people like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall are lost, because they can only think of in terms of how do we fix capitalism, rather than how do we change capitalism so that we don't have to keep fixing it. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.